CA just released a blog detailing a bunch of battle improvement changes coming to Warhammer 3. We're going to take a look at this and talk about the bigger implications of these changes. So it's quality of life changes for the most part, little things that kind of improve here and there to make the game more efficient, make things easier to understand, or just make some systems work better. So kicking it off with the in-battle changes, starting at the top with flying toggle. This one we've seen in recent videos. People have been asking for it for a long time, so it's good that it's finally made it in. For the most part, this is kind of going to be a safety feature for your flying units more than anything else, because in some situations, let's say you bring Karl Franz on Deathclaw, so he's flying up in the air and you're facing the High Elves, and they've got Teclis on an Arcane Phoenix and a Dragon. So Karl Franz is outnumbered in the air. It's very dangerous for him to stay there. There's a good chance that both of those units will come after the lone Karl Franz and take him out very quickly. But if Karl can land on the ground, he can sit amongst some halberds, he can sit amongst some demigryphs, he can be there ready with support instead of having to sit in the air trying to avoid those two for the entire battle, or attacking enemy units just so he can go to ground to try and escape them. So this just allows you to manage that vulnerability, which is really helpful. And in the video that came out alongside this blog, it says that you can fly the Cathay flying cavalry over the enemy, land them behind, and then charge them in the back on foot. I think that's actually not a good idea because you'd get more charge and collision damage coming in from the air because you'll be moving faster. So I'm not sure you'd actually want to use it for that, but I guess the option's there. Moving on, we've got hotkeys, and they've added a hotkey for finding idle units. So units that aren't fighting anybody or moving anywhere, you'll quickly be able to find them. This is especially useful for large armies and large armies with units that rout a lot. So any unit that routes off into the forest and you forget about them for most of the battle when you could have used them and they could have won the battle for you, well, now you'll be able to find them much easier with this hotkey. So that's a really nice addition just to help with micro somewhat. And then we have special abilities now have their own hotkeys. Guard mode, skirmish mode, and fire at will now have hotkeys. Thank the maker. This is something I've always wondered. I put it in a video a few months ago moaning about it. Why is half of the UI assignable to hotkeys and half of it not, especially important buttons like guard and skirmish mode? Well, now we've got them, thank God. So we can use hopefully all of the UI, assign it to hotkeys, and try to be a little bit more efficient with the micro. So really happy for that. Looking forward to trying to figure out a nice hotkey system for being nice and efficient in Total War. Now we move on to formations. In Three Kingdoms, you can select a whole bunch of units, drag them as a box, and it will kind of organize them. It worked okay, and it'll probably be fine for campaign. Now that's in Total War Warhammer 3, it probably won't be that much use to multiplayer and for those who really like to arrange their army, but it's an improvement of some kind all the same. And the set formation feature has apparently had some improvements, but again, I don't think that'll be greatly useful for the most part. One really nice change here, though, is the last one. In standard campaign field battles, an army's formation at the end of the deployment phase will be snapshotted and used as default in the army's next battle. So basically, it'll save your formation, which means you don't have to set up your army every single time in campaign. This is something I'm really glad to see. It's another thing I moaned about in that video before. It's just a really nice time saver. It's not essential, we don't need it, but it does make life a lot easier when you don't have to arrange your army at the start of every single battle you fight. It'll save a good amount of time in the long run. If you think about how many battles you fight, and you probably spend a minute or two setting up your army before you hit start battle. So it could end up saving an hour or two of playtime, not having to arrange troops all the time. So that's the formation stuff. On to healing and fatigue. First of all, healing is now applied as a percentage of max health per second rather than a flat value. So this should make healing more useful all across the board, because if you do Earthblood on a bunch of units and one of those units is a Dread Saurian, well, currently Earthblood restores 300 health, and 300 health of a Dread Saurian is pretty much nothing. But 300 health onto some Skink cohort, they only have about 3,000 health, so that is a fair chunk of their health back. And I guess it also means there'll be more of an emphasis on healing the more expensive units because you'll get more for your magical money. Because 10% of a Dread Saurian's health bar is way more than 10% of the Skink's health bar, for example. Moving on, another really interesting one here. Healing can now be stunted by inflicting any amount of fire damage to the target, massively slowing all healing effects for several seconds. This is pretty huge. You can actually negate healing now, because in Warhammer 2 you can't really do that. If somebody uses their heals well, there's nothing you can do about it. Whereas other magic spells, you can avoid them by simply moving out the way if they're like a wind spell or something, and buffs, if a unit that you're fighting gets buffed, you can just try to run away from them until their buff has ended. So you can kind of avoid certain spells in that way, but healing, you could never do anything about, but now you can. And this is going to add some real value to the Fire lorebook even more. It was already a great lorebook. Now it's going to be even better with Flaming Sword of Ruin and other abilities and spells that imbue fire. That's going to be huge. When you see a unit healing, you pop Flaming Sword of Ruin on whoever they're fighting and it'll negate their healing, at least somewhat. Next, fatigue modifying abilities now take place over time instead of all at once. I don't have too much to say on this one. I'm not sure of any huge implications this will have. It'll drain enemies slower of fatigue, but everyone's always fucking tired anyway, so who knows. Moving down to bracing. This is a pretty huge one. I pointed it out in my roster videos for Cathay. Charge Reflection. This basically does damage to anything that charges into braced spear type units. This in Warhammer is going to be pretty huge. It's a system that's in 3 Kingdoms. If you charge a cavalry unit into a braced spear unit in 3 Kingdoms, it can absolutely destroy the cavalry. So braced spear units are just going to be more dangerous all round. Even if infantry charges into them, I believe they'll still do damage to those, not just cavalry. But the amount of damage done is going to vary between the quality of the different spear units. So for example, High Elf Spearmen won't do as much damage as Phoenix Guard when charged into by an enemy unit. So yeah, this is a pretty huge thing to come to Total War Warhammer battles, so we'll see how much it changes the game up. It's going to serve to make infantry more useful and more viable, as currently in Warhammer 2 they're a bit overshadowed by mobility. So Charge Reflection should help spear type units be much more useful now. Although, is it going to make other types of units not so good? Is cavalry going to suffer from this? Is monstrous infantry going to suffer from this? I guess as long as you don't charge into the braced units, you should be okay. You might need to be a little more careful than you perhaps are right now. Also in the bracing category, units now have a little icon to indicate that they're braced, so this is just going to help us know which units are a good or bad idea to charge into, which ones are kind of safe and braced for an attack, and which ones aren't quite ready yet. That's going to be just useful, helpful information to help us make choices better in battles. Moving on to spells, added an option to automatically take the game into slow motion while you aim an ability or spell. This is a nice touch for campaign and will help newer players to manage their magic and use their spells more effectively. But it is a toggleable option, so you don't have to have it on if you just want to keep the game flowing all the time. And I imagine this 99% won't go to multiplayer because it'll be a pretty big giveaway if time slows down. You'll know that your enemy is casting a spell, or they'll know that you're casting a spell. So most definitely won't be in multiplayer, but it's a nice addition for the campaign. On to another thing we kind of knew already. Magic resistance has been reworked into spell resistance. So basically, if you have a unit that has spell resistance, it'll be protected from damage that's done by actual magical spells or actual magical abilities, and not by just units with magical attacks on their weapon damage. So those units with magical attacks on their weapon damage will pretty much purely be good against units with physical resistances, and that's it now. And that's going to be a little bit of a downer for the dwarfs. They're still going to be able to be protected from magical spells, but currently they can kind of ward off any unit with magical attacks and make them less effective, but they won't be able to do that anymore. So the poor old dwarfs taking a hit there, I think. But with all the Chaos factions and the demons coming to Warhammer 3 and them all having magical attacks, this is probably a needed change. And apparently Thorn effect spells, including Shield of Thorns, have been reworked in some way. Doesn't really tell us much though, or show us in that video, I don't think, so who knows. Moving on down to the UI related matters, health bars, introduction of lazy health bars. So you might have noticed this in some of the footage. When a unit takes a big chunk of damage, the damage is kind of there in a faded red, and then it slowly goes down, so you can see how much damage was done on that attack. So this is a nice way to get a little bit more information on how much damage was really done on a particular attack, a spell, a charge, whatever. That's a nice little bit of extra information for us. And also on the health bars, you may have noticed again in the footage, there's little white lines on the health bar to indicate a quarter, half, or 3/4, so you can kind of see a more accurate representation of how much health your unit has left. That's going to be helpful for me when I'm casting battles and talking about this unit just took a quarter of its health and damage, half its health and damage. Now I can be more accurate with those little lines. Moving down to stats and unit panels, we can now see entity mass on the entity size tooltip. This is another nice little bit of extra information for those who want it. It's not something that most people are going to need to know, but for those who are interested, it's there and you can see how chunky and heavy your units are, how likely they are to pull through other units and things like that. Also, as we've seen before in previous footage that I've shown at least, abilities, attributes and resistances can now be expanded on a more readable list on the unit panel. So it's just more information on the unit card to help us understand everything. And there's also the 3-tier unit system, another thing I've pointed out before in previous videos. So we already know about this, but it's another nice addition to help us identify the quality of a unit. They'll either be a bronze with a numeral 1 in it, a silver little shield with a numeral 2, or a gold shield with a numeral 3. And that'll tell you what quality of unit you're dealing with. So this is just helpful for newer players especially, to help them understand and know which units are particularly dangerous and which ones kind of aren't. To custom battles, and another pretty big change. Sub-factions have been removed from custom battles quick battles and replaced by having to pick your race and then selecting the color profile from a selection. So it seems like the days of Avalon having tree units and followers of Nagash having vampire units and stuff like that are over. It's just going to be one faction and you can just change the color of them now. Ultimately, while this probably will irk a few people who like their sub-factions, this is probably a good thing really. It was quite inconsistent to have some factions that were made better and more interesting, like Avalon having tree units, and other factions to simply be the base faction but worse, like Middenland who were the Empire roster but just with way less stuff. It didn't really make sense. You either needed to make every single sub-faction unique in some way, or none at all. They've gone with the none at all option, and I think that's probably better, because otherwise everyone's got to learn all the different sub-factions, and that just serves to make multiplayer way more inaccessible for newer players. And that's not a good thing. We want to encourage more people to play multiplayer, so I think this is a good way. It's just the basic 20-odd factions now that you have to learn. You don't have to worry about sub-factions. Then we have custom battle maps can now be searched and filtered. You can also tag favorite maps. This is going to be pretty damn huge for me, hosting multiplayer battles all the time, wondering, hey, is this a good map to play on? And then we get in there and we find it's a tiny little map and a 2v2, and then people have no room to move. So now at least I can tag the favorite ones and I'll know which are good maps, which are nice even maps as well for people to fight on, because sometimes maps have an advantage to one side. So yeah, this is a really nice feature, one for the multiplayer kids. And again, for the multiplayer kids, you can now change unit sizes in the custom battle lobby. You don't have to go to your graphics options and change them. That just makes life a little bit easier for us, but I don't think people really change this option that much anyway. And improved army preset saving with filtering, searching, and being able to view by specific races, battle types. So that's good. We can get a little more organization to our saved builds now. Again, it's just going to make life easier for all us multiplayer kids. Should be really helpful. And then there's a new unit browser, which sounds kind of like what we can pretty much already do in custom battles anyway. You just change the army and look at the units, but I guess maybe you can use this in battle. So if you're in campaign and you don't know what a unit does, you can use that to help you find out more about the unit, and should help people learn units that little bit better. Maybe. There we go. Some pretty big changes in there. A lot of stuff I'm glad to see. I don't think there's anything I dislike. I'm happy with all of these changes. They're all serving to make the game better, so yeah. What about you people? How do you feel about these changes? Anything you don't like? I imagine maybe the sub-factions thing might annoy some people, but I guess that's only a few people. There's also some better tree visibility. As you can see in the video here, it mentions there are a few other things that are in the video that I don't think are in this blog, so do check out the video if you're interested. I hope you've enjoyed this. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the future.